You stand at the edge of the Bavarian woods, where the late March wind carries a bite that seems to bypass the skin and settle directly into the bone. The farmstead of Hinterkaifeck looms ahead, a solitary cluster of timber and stone swallowed by the oppressive silence of the rolling plains. Your boots crunch against the crust of frozen snow, but as you look down, you realize you aren't the only one who has left a mark here. A trail of footprints leads from the dark tree line toward the house, crisp and purposeful. Yet, as your eyes trace the path back to the forest, the snow remains undisturbed. There are no tracks leaving the farm. Somewhere above, in the lightless void of the attic, a floorboard groans under a weight that shouldn't be there, and you realize with a sickening clarity that the house is breathing, even if the family inside is not. The isolation of the Upper Bavarian farmstead in 1922 was not merely a matter of geography, but a deliberate choice by the Gruber family to withdraw from a world they neither trusted nor liked. Andreas Gruber, a 63-year-old patriarch with a reputation for being as cold as the soil he tilled, lived there with his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, and her 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. It was a household defined by whispers and a cloying sense of unease, long before the first drop of blood was spilled. The neighbors in the nearby town of Kaifeck spoke of the family in hushed tones, aware of the dark rumors of incest and the abrasive nature of Andreas, which acted like a wall around the property. This social exile meant that when the shadows began to move within the house, there was no one to call to, and no one close enough to hear the sounds of a struggle. The descent into the nightmare began days before the end of March, heralded by signs that Andreas Gruber tried to dismiss as the tricks of a tired mind. He had found a local newspaper on the porch that no one in the family had purchased, its presence an alien intrusion from a world they avoided. Shortly after, the patriarch discovered deep scratches on the lock of the toolshed, as if someone had spent hours trying to find a way inside. Perhaps the most chilling omen was the discovery of footprints in the fresh snow, leading from the woods directly to the farm's machine shed. Yet remarkably, no return tracks were ever found. Despite the growing evidence of a prowler, Andreas never reported these incidents to the police, choosing instead to patrol his own borders with a growing sense of paranoia that would soon prove to be entirely justified. The atmosphere within the farmstead grew so heavy with unspoken dread that the family's previous maid had fled the property months earlier, claiming the house was haunted by footsteps in the attic and the feeling of eyes following her through the halls. Her replacement, Maria Baumgartner, arrived on the afternoon of March 31st, 1922, likely unaware that she was stepping into a tomb that had already been prepared for her. As the sun dipped below the horizon on that final Friday of the month, a heavy silence settled over the barn and the living quarters. The transition from life to a state of primal terror happened in the darkness of the barn, where one by one members of the family were lured into the shadows. Investigators would later piece together a sequence of events that defied the logic of a simple robbery, suggesting instead a killer who moved with a terrifying precision. It is believed that Victoria and her mother Cecilia were the first to be drawn to the barn, perhaps by a strange noise or the distress of the cattle. Upon entering, they were met not by an animal, but by a sharpened mattock, a tool used for breaking the earth, now repurposed for breaking bone. The elderly Cecilia and her daughter were struck down with such force that their skulls were shattered, their bodies left in the straw as the killer waited for the next victim. Andreas was likely the next to follow the silence of his family into the barn. only to meet the same brutal end at the hands of the intruder who had been living in his attic for days. The youngest Cecilia, only 7 years old, was the final member of the family to be brought to the charnel house in the barn. The evidence found during the eventual autopsies revealed a detail so harrowing that it continues to haunt the history of the case. The young girl did not die instantly. Records indicate that she survived for several hours after the attack, lying in the straw next to the bodies of her mother and grandparents. And in her final moments of agony, she had torn out tufts of her own hair. This prolonged suffering paints a picture of a killer who was either indifferent to the screams of a child or who remained close enough to ensure that no help would ever reach her. While the barn held the majority of the victims, the killer's work was not yet finished, leading them back across the courtyard and into the warmth of the farmhouse. Maria Baumgartner, who had been in the house for less than 24 hours, was murdered in her bedchamber, never having the chance to unpack her few belongings. The smallest victim, 2-year-old Joseph, was killed in his crib in his mother's bedroom, the heavy blow of the mattock ending the Gruber bloodline with a final strike. With the entire household silent, the farm fell into a period of macabre stillness that would last for 4 days, as the world outside remained oblivious to the horrors contained within the walls of Hinterkaifeck. What followed the murders is perhaps more disturbing than the violence itself, as evidence suggests that the killer did not flee into the night, but instead took up residence in the house with the dead. For several days after March 31st, neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney and a steady light in the windows after dark. The cattle were fed, the cows were milked, and bread was eaten from the kitchen pantry, all while the bodies of the family lay cooling in the barn and the bedrooms. This was not the behavior of a panicked thief, but of a ghost made of flesh and bone, a man who felt entirely at home in the house he had just turned into a graveyard. The discovery of the crime didn't occur until April 4th, sparked by the younger Cecilia's absence from school and the family's failure to appear for Sunday service. A group of neighbors, led by a man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, eventually forced their way into the farmstead, only to be met by a scene that would scar the collective memory of the region. They found the 4 victims in the barn, stacked carefully and covered with straw and a discarded door, a detail that suggested a strange post-mortem ritual or a desire to hide the remains from casual view. The sight of the child amidst the wreckage of her family was enough to break even the most hardened of the search party. Yet the mystery only deepened as the authorities began their work. When the Munich police arrived at the scene, they were confronted with a crime that felt both personal and meticulously planned. There was no sign of a struggle in the house that suggested a robbery gone wrong, as significant amounts of money and jewelry were left untouched in plain sight. The focus of the killer had been the people, not their possessions. And the choice of the mattock, an intimate weapon, suggested a murderer who wanted to feel the impact of every blow. The investigation was hampered from the start by the sheer number of people who had trampled the crime scene before the police arrived. Yet the evidence pointed to someone who knew the layout of the farm. Suspicion quickly turned toward Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who had led the search party and who had a complicated, often volatile history with the Gruber family. Schlittenbauer had previously been involved in a paternity dispute with Victoria Gabriel, and his behavior at the crime scene raised immediate red flags for both the neighbors and the police. While others recoiled in horror from the bodies, reports suggest that Schlittenbauer moved among them with a strange lack of hesitation, even touching and moving the remains before the authorities could examine them. When questioned about this blatant contamination of the scene, Schlittenbauer offered an explanation that was as tragic as it was suspicious. He claimed he was frantically digging through the straw to find the infant, Josef, the very child he had fought a bitter legal battle over supporting. It was a detail that left everyone torn. Yet, some theorized that his presence in the search party was a calculated move to discover the bodies and perhaps tamper with evidence that might link him to the crime. The case against Schlittenbauer was compelling to many in the community, built on the foundation of a perceived motive of revenge and the proximity of his own farm. However, he was never charged, largely because there was no physical evidence to place the weapon in his hand at the time of the murders. He spent the rest of his life in the shadow of these accusations, filing several successful defamation lawsuits against those who called him a murderer. But the stigma remained. The doubt surrounding his involvement stems from the sheer logistics of the crime. It is difficult to imagine a local man, well known to the family, living in their attic for days without being detected, or having the cold resolve to feed the cattle of the people he had just slaughtered. Another theory that has persisted through the decades involves the return of Victoria's husband, Karl Gabriel, who was reported to have died in the trenches of the First World War. While official records stated he had been killed in 1914, his body was never recovered, leading some to believe he had survived and returned to find his wife involved with another man. Proponents of this theory argue that a soldier hardened by the brutality of the Great War would have the stomach for such a methodical and cold-blooded killing. Some of Gabriel's former comrades later claimed that he had not died in the war, but had instead deserted or been captured, fueling the legend of a vengeful ghost returning to claim his family by destroying it. The difficulty with the Karl Gabriel theory lies in the lack of any verifiable sighting of him in the area following the war, and the question of why he would wait 8 years to return and commit such a crime. If he were the killer, his intimate knowledge of the farm would explain how he navigated the house in total darkness, and his emotional connection to the family might explain the odd behavior of covering the bodies. Yet, like the case against Schlittenbauer, the evidence is largely circumstantial, relying more on the poetic darkness of the narrative than on hard forensic proof. The possibility remains that the killer was someone entirely unknown, a transient or a vagrant who found the isolation of Hinterkaifeck to be the perfect sanctuary. In the years following the murders, the farmstead itself became a monument to the tragedy, a place where the earth seemed to refuse to heal. In 1923, just a year after the killings, the entire farm was demolished, leaving nothing behind but a small memorial and the lingering questions of a failed investigation. During the demolition, the murder weapon was found hidden in the hayloft, tucked away near where the killer had likely slept while watching the family below. This discovery confirmed that the intruder had been a constant, yet invisible presence in the days leading up to the massacre, listening to the sounds of the children playing and the adults arguing, all while holding the instrument of their demise. Perhaps the most gruesome chapter of the investigation involved the victims' heads, which were removed and sent to Munich for examination by clairvoyants and forensic specialists. The skulls were studied in the hopes that the trauma patterns might reveal the identity of the killer. But these efforts yielded no breakthroughs. In a tragic twist of fate, the skulls were lost during the chaos of the Second World War. So the victims of Hinterkaifeck were buried without their heads, and the physical evidence of their trauma vanishing forever. This loss seems to mirror the state of the case itself. A story where the most vital pieces of the puzzle have been stripped away by time and neglect. As the decades turned into a century, the Hinterkaifeck murders transitioned from a criminal case into a piece of dark folklore, a reminder of the horrors that can bloom in the silence of the countryside. The mystery endures not just because of the brutality of the acts, but because of the 4 days of silence that followed, where a killer lived among his victims, perhaps eating at their table and sleeping under their roof. It suggests a level of psychological detachment that is far more terrifying than a momentary burst of violence. The farm is gone now, replaced by open fields and a quiet memorial, but the story refuses to be buried. It lingers in the way the wind sounds as it passes through the trees near the old site, and in the unsettling realization that the most dangerous presence is often the one that has already made itself at home.